So, welcome again, everyone, to tonight's virtual lecture, Opening the Way, New Research and Other Items in New York's Black Colonial History. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Levada Nahan, who is the interpreter of African American history for the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. She is also a cultural and culinary historian focused on New Netherland and New York, the 17th through the 19th centuries, specializing in enslaved and free Black history. She also has 30 years of public history experience. Levada is joining us by phone tonight, so welcome, Levada.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Sarah and Michael and everyone at Phyllis Meador Hall for giving me this opportunity and for having me join you this evening. And thank you all for coming. I'm really excited about history, and I'm really excited right now. I think that overall, history is a never-ending story, one that I can pick up and I can put down at any time, one that allows me to jump into any time period or culture and explore to my heart's content. One thing I know for sure is that it is not a static subject. And for New Netherland and New York Black history, right now it feels like a very, very wonderful train that is gaining some serious speed. So this evening, I just want to touch on some of the things that I've been aware of that are shifting what I thought I knew and expanding areas in ways that add a richness to what I share with the public as a public historian. I am truly grateful for all of the people who share what they're working on with me so that I may share it with you and use it to enrich my own research projects. I am also grateful to the various levels of historians, archaeologists, librarians, archivists, curators, genealogists, and others who daily are allowing their curiosity full reign. I love learning, and these days, to not do so has to be a very conscious choice. Sources for updated information are all around us. That's perhaps one of the biggest challenges that we're now facing, and it is truly a blessing. We have so much happening that it is quite easy to miss things, and I feel that, feel that you're behind. We fall into what we often hear people speak to us is like, why didn't I know that? Or why didn't I know that that was happening? Honestly, I have to say, because a whole lot is going on. Every level of historic research in African and African descent history in New York is happening in one way or another, both directly and indirectly. The information about the overall cultures of New Netherland and New York, reconnecting them to the larger world, and also reconstructing the communities and connections within them is weaving partnerships, networks, and opening lines of sharing like at no other time. Next slide, please. Within the last 2 months alone, I have had the pleasure of attending several amazing conferences right here in New York. At the Museum Association of New York's annual conference in Albany, I learned so much from people working in the subject matter from Long Island to the Canada border. Fort Ontario, just 2 weeks ago, had their annual New York Military History Conference, and this year's focus was on the service of Blacks. And it began in the 17th century with me looking at Keith's War and going all the way up to World War I. Last weekend was an amazing and rather overwhelming 2-day conference given by the New Netherland Institute on slavery in New Netherland and the Dutch Atlantic. I've had conversations of all sorts, learning about things like the reinterpretation at Van Buren's home and the partnership between the National Park Service, the African American Archive of Columbia County, Schuyler Mansion, and others in the Albany area. There is a new film that was just released last week by Maybe Farm in which I participate, but we filmed separately. So it wasn't until I started watching it earlier this week, and I learned so much more about the enslaved on the farm, but also a lot about the enslaved community in Schenectady. The central, western, and Canadian border areas have been too often left out of our story when we're crafting around the enslaved and free Blacks. And this new research and new ways of sharing this history, like the film, is reaching out and helping us to change that. So when people who are still hearing about the institution of slavery for the first time ask me where to start delving into the topic, I find myself simply replying, anywhere. And truly, I am not meaning to be flippant, but now, unlike years ago, now it is honestly, it's that simple. And I am so thrilled that it is. From academic papers to historic sites and society newsletters and blogs, exhibits and installations, new research is spilling out in an easily accessible way as never before. Next slide, please. Recently, I went back to a book that is still at the top of my book list, and I feel it is a great starting point, Slavery in New York. It is an amazing collection of essays written by scholars, with each chapter moving us along the timeline of African and African descendant history in our colonial paths from the beginning into the new nation period. While working on the presentation for enslaved African men being used as soldiers during the New Netherland period, I reread the first chapter and realized how out of date it was. Next slide, please. First, I want to highlight a very important research article that was now gives us a date for the arrival of the first enslaved men into the colony. We have a ship's name, we have the circumstances, and a larger historic context because of a paper written by Jaap Jacobs, published last summer in the journal New York History. So now we know that on August the 29th, 1627, our story around enslavement in the colony begins. This paper moves us from research done by E.B. O'Callaghan in the late 19th century, which pointed to 11 men and 1625 or 1626. I have been sharing those numbers and dates for nearly 30 years, and now I'm having to shift. Next slide, please. To make things even better, this past weekend at the New Netherlands two-day conference, amazing scholars from the U.S. and the Netherlands shared 20-minute presentations on various panels that left me so full. And on Saturday, Jerome DeWolf, probably best known for his book, The Pinkster King and the King of Congo, well, at least to us in New York, presented research that he has done since last summer. Jaap's paper looks at the Dutch ships and how a Dutch privateer acquires the enslaved and brought them to New Netherland. They came from a Spanish or Portuguese ship that had been attacked. DeWolf researched Spanish and Portuguese ships who were in the area or passed through the area around the time Jaap had pinpointed for the enslaved to have been captured, that may be supplied and had been taken from a ship that may have supplied them. And DeWolf found one. I cannot wait until that paper is published. The New Netherland period is the foundation of the colony. Research in the WIC and East India Company is happening in the Netherlands and as well as here in the U.S. and it continues to explore the depth and breadth of its impact on the national history. Dr. Charles Gehring is hitting 50 years of translation work, and there is still more to be done. The most recent papers published are letters of Petrus Stuyvesant, and so I have more on my reading list. July the 1st, 2023 through July 1st, 2024 is the Netherlands Slavery Memorial Year, and commemorating the colony of New Netherland will continue until 2025. The enslaved arrived here in small and large numbers, but the Dutch imported hundreds into Curaçao and sold them to the Spanish, even as New Netherland was asking for more. With enslaved arriving in small numbers, but also in large quantities, beginning with the ship Gideon, we are having to reinterpret those first 40 years, because now we have more than just dates and names. The multilingual exploration is gifting us a cultural picture that is way more exciting than most of the films I watch. With them, we can craft exciting tours, full of engaging history, school programs that are captivating. I have chosen to take the time in 2024 through 2025 to catch up on what's out there. Work published in the early 2000s around the early period has been looked at and expanded. Those early things, like that first chapter in Slavery in New York, written by Christopher Moore, laid the foundation. But the house of work being built upon that foundation is proving to be extremely fine. Next slide, please. With the 400th anniversary of the colony of New Netherland and the 400th anniversary of the founding of its capital, New Amsterdam, many programs, exhibits are being and will continue to be offered in the next year or so. Currently, the New York Historical Society has New York Before New York, an installation that is small but extremely powerful. And I really encourage everyone to go down and see it. It closes in mid-July. Pieces of the display include the Costello Plan, a very famous bird's eye view map of New Amsterdam that has not been in New York probably for at least 20 years. There is also that famous letter that Peter Minuit sent to the WIC when he purchased the island of Manhattan. But next to it is a very powerful letter written by living Munsee Lenape chiefs to their ancestor, simply asking, did they know? And listing this long and hard-to-read list of consequences because of that seemingly purchase. In terms of African history, next slide, please. I believe for the first time, a piece of Congolese religious vessel that had been removed from a 17th century Dutch house in New Amsterdam's cellar, the area where enslaved Africans lived, and which is part of the State Museum's collection, is on display. Long identified as an Nkisi, a type of Congolese prayer vessel, it now bears correct interpretation done by Dr. Barbero Martinez Ruiz, a leading scholar on Congolese religion and culture. Now properly labeled, excuse me, and explained, the Mpungu is displayed on an acrylic stand, which shows the layers of artifacts as they would have been put into the vessel, and also how the archaeologists found them. Across the state, the presence of West Central African Congolese and West African Yoruba and Akan religious artifacts dating from the 17th through 19th century have been unearthed, yet very little of this material has been displayed. Crystals, a variety of beads, particularly cowrie and other shells, and other religious and cultural material linked specifically to African culture has lain dormant. Working across disciplines is allowing us to ensure we are sharing proper information, and as I actively explore this area more, I am learning of material already on display and other pieces within collections. Noted archaeologists have written papers and more are being done, and I'm currently building a resource list which I hope to share by this time next year. Next slide, please. Another article in the same issue of New York, the journal New York History also caught my attention. Often, it isn't about new research that broadens our consciousness. It is also about new perspectives. It is about how we look at things and perhaps consider them in a different way. One broader and maybe more interesting than we've done in the past. Building a deeper, fuller cultural context, putting it into the rhythm and flow of life. Community Building in the History of Memory of Slavery in Dutch New York by Anne-Claire Vasquez. Opening lines immediately spoke to me. Quote, looking at slavery from the perspective of the community breaks the representation of the enslaved as victims of a harsh system. Northern slavery, especially, has traditionally been depicted as a world in which the enslaved were totally isolated, rarely being more than 2 or 3 per household. With limited possibilities of contact with other individuals of the same culture. Focusing on the community, this immediately restores enslaved people's humanity and agency. One can see them as a group in which they are unfortunately seen as anonymous. Except for those individuals who occasionally stand out in archival records, but in which they are willing to associate themselves and interact with one another. They can find comfort and relief despite their predicament. Quote, close. As we look at the research that is particularly being done on the local levels, I found myself, after reading that article, questioning about, are we reconnecting the communities in which the enslaved flowed? Are we speaking of the neighbors or family members and not consider the groups of enslaved that flowed with them, moved between the European families? Do we think only in terms of that 1 to 2 people in rural communities and negate how connected New Amsterdam or New York was to Beverwyck or Albany? Do we have links to the Western regions within our stories that we are not sharing? Are there connections through commerce to the Caribbean and the West Indies? Or are we part of families that are moving the enslaved back and forth? Pinkster, for me, is not a one-off, but a real large display of long existing African and descendant communities that crossed 200 years between those that were enslaved and free generation after generation. That is something for us to really think about, and not just in terms of adding words to a tour, but perhaps even as we look for material to expand programming. Next, please. And we should be up to slide 9. Current research is also opening up space for those who were never enslaved. Many are looking at the names that appear on the early records that say that they were not enslaved, and they are here. Where did they come from? What was their story? This is not only in the Hudson River Valley, but within the last 6 months, my colleague Travis Bowman shared with me a very slim book called The Willegi Negroes from up on that was placed him up on the Mohawk River in the Mohawk River Valley. It is known that before the 11 and their wives received their half enslavement or freedom, depending on how you want to look at it, there were people who received acreage and they were already listed as being free. In a recent conversation at the Manny Conference, I spoke to a local Hudson Valley Museum director about records she had come to that traced free Blacks who had moved from the Netherlands and settled in the area. At this past weekend's Dutch conference, a scholar shared his research into Amsterdam's 17th century Black community, an established community of predominantly women, where the majority of their men or husbands were sailors. The links, although right now thin, they are growing, and they are allowing to go back to books like Slavery in New York and reconsider how we form the stories of culture and community in the language we use as we build and update new tours. These links help us to look at the material within our own collections and those of our neighbors across town, in the next town, in the area, and say, hey, are we missing connections? Are we missing stories? Are we missing people? Next slide, please. As we approach 2027, we are now faced with a very different year of commemoration than we had 2 years ago. Then it was just, and not just, but then it was the 200th anniversary of the Act of Gradual Abolition. And that was on July the 4th and the 5th. The legal end of slavery, but not the freeing of all those held in bondage. Now, with August the 29th, just 8 weeks later, we come full circle to the beginning and to do it all again. As we continue through the period of transition following the history of 1827 into the years that mirror the beginning of the Underground Railroad, will we continue the research and work building, updating, and expanding the stories of the years of enslavement, weaving a fuller, richer cloth, or will we sink back and say, well done, and move on to something else? I honestly can't imagine that the growing body of research on all levels is suddenly going to stop. But it can be tempting. It can be really easy to say, we've done that, and pat ourselves on the back and move on. But in my gut and in my heart, I believe that the momentum is too great, and it will gain force as we continue to update what we know and what we share with the public in the next few years, re-educating ourselves and everyone else about the enslaved and the free. I, for one, know I will continue. We are learning on every level, seeing people, hearing their names, speaking their numbers, exploring their gifts and their talents, the cultural markers and the religious diversity. I am a full believer that history is a never-ending story, and I am curious enough to keep turning the pages, and I hope that you are too. Last slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lavada. That was a really great overview into some of the cutting edge research that's happening across the world about the history of Black history of New York and the history of enslaved people in New York. I dropped a number of links in the comments for those of you who haven't noticed yet to some of the articles Lavada and exhibits Lavada was referencing. Does anybody have any questions for Lavada? Oh, it looks like John has his hand up. John, go ahead. Let's see. Are you allowed to unmute? I don't know. Maybe folks, if you just drop your questions in the chat, I can't figure out how to unmute you, so because it's a webinar. So if you have questions and you drop them in the chat, I will read them aloud so Lavada can answer them. Oh, Linda, you've got your hand raised. Let's see if I can unmute you. Okay, looks like you're unmuted, Linda. Maybe not. Man, this has just been a day, hasn't it, Lavada?
I tell you, it has been one technical glitch after another.
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, what the heck?
Oh, wait, sorry. Is that better?
It's echoing now. Oh my God. Okay. Okay, Linda is asking, is Fouquet's article generally available online or must you have special access to, I shared the Project Muse link. Linda, often, so like I have a New York Public Library card and I am able to access Project Muse through the New York Public Library. So you could check with your library if you can access it. Otherwise, New York History, I think it's also accessible through JSTOR, and probably your local university library has hard copies of it. So that's where I would recommend checking. Any other questions? Well, while people are thinking about it, I can let you know that if you'd like to see Lavada in person, she will be joining us for our Pinkster Festival at Phillips Manor Hall this Saturday. Lavada is giving a talk on Pinkster foodways. At what time? I did not think to look for that. I think it's 1:30 or 1 o'clock. Let me get on the website here. I should know I made the schedule, but I don't have it off the top of my head. Okay, Lavada is talking at 1:30. 1:30 at Phillips Manor Hall. Oh, and Lavada, you are muted on both of your things now, so.
Yes, I was. I was trying to get rid of the echo. I also want to encourage people, a lot is going on around programming too with Blacks in the military as we go towards the Rev War. So what's happening if you have enslaved on your property, or if you are in an area where they were enslaved, what happened to them during the Rev War? There were a lot of people who left. There were a lot of people who stayed in place. A number of people are looking at the Book of Negroes and looking for people that may be connected to their sites and, you know, following that history through. So I do not discount Historic Society and Sites newsletters and blogs. A lot of people are publishing within their own community, and it's often hard to keep up with all of that reading, but particularly if you are looking for programming or program presenters, you know, there is such a rich cadre of colleagues that we have around the state who can do programming, and not everyone ends up with a digital glitch like we have today. But it is, you know, and we have so many young interpreters in this field who are doing research, looking for places to do programming. So don't discount your colleagues as we go through these next few years. You can really bring a fuller story, particularly if you look out of your immediate community. I know a lot of our program is Hudson River Valley heavy, but don't discount Western New York. Don't discount Long Island. Don't discount Northern Jersey or Southern Connecticut. All of us are telling very similar stories, but are particular to our niche. So do look at what's happening at other sites. If names appear regularly within your historic papers, reach out to those sites and see what they're doing and bring those names into your site because they're showing up in your documents already.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat. Loisa says, hi, I'm an Afro-Indigenous archaeologist living in Brooklyn. I was wondering if there are any volunteer opportunities to help with excavations.
Actually, for that, you would have to look at the archaeological programs. There are several archaeologists who are very active, and many have schools. There are also contract archaeologists that work for situations like the state. Most of our archaeologists are now contract archaeologists. So there is a New York State Archaeological Association, so you could reach out to them. If there, I know Hofstra has an archaeological department, BART has an active one, SUNY New Paltz has one, Oswego has one. So you look around at the universities and colleges in your area and see if they have any archaeological programs. If you're living near a site that you think may be doing a dig, give them a call and ask them who they're working with. It's a network that is very active, and that would be a good place to start.
Great, thank you. Scott asks, might anything you learned recently impact interpretation at Phillips Manor Hall? You want me to say that?
Actually, they're doing a lot of research that is helping me. So, yes, I think that what particularly for Phillips Manor Hall and many of the sites where, like Sylvester Manor out on Shelter Island, Claremont up in the Hudson River Valley, the Livingstons, the families that had strong connections to the Caribbean and West Indies. And one of the things that is coming out and that came out in the conference a lot, was the use of privateers, but also the development of individuals investing in these slave ships. You know, we're so used to thinking, oh, well, the Phillips owned the boats, right? But they had private investors. A lot of and that's the thing, that whole development of the corporation and those individual investors really is coming forward. And we're seeing then families included or people included that we may not have considered. And I think that is what I'm finding really fascinating, because that opens up the economic links in a much broader way. So if you have a site where they may not be owning the ship, but they're growing wheat. Who are they selling that wheat to? If they are investing in trade, who are they investing with? And what are those shipments full of? Because it isn't always just about the people. It is also about the goods that are the result of slave labor, like sugar and salt and indigo and logwood and other Caribbean West Indies products coming into New York. So who's investing? Who's buying? That revenue is part of the transatlantic slave trade and part of the institution of slavery in New York. And I think in many cases, I know for me, my eyes moving towards economics started about almost 2 years ago now when I interviewed Andrea Mosterman, and I read her book. And like many scholars, she took us almost to the edge and said, we look like, act like, but are not quite a society, a slave society, as opposed to being a society with slaves. And when I asked her what that line was, she talked about the economics. And I finally said, okay, I was a little salty, but that saltiness has really helped me to do that research and see. And that's what came out a lot in the conference. That's what's coming a lot. And even going back and reading the Common Council minutes, reading those early documents that are being translated, reestablishing, seeing those names showing up now in documents that we have out of Curacao, that we have out of Brazil, that we have out of Barbados, that we have out of Jamaica. A lot of that stuff is now being digitized and put in online. And it is helping us to see how many just average people invested in these trade ships. New York merchant traders are trading all over the world, and they're doing that for like 200 years. Because the one thing that a lot of this has helped me to see too, we think of 1664 and like it was Dutch on one side and British on the other. But the bottom line is that is only at the top. Everybody else remains the same. They keep doing business the same way. They keep making money the same way. And that is what we really need to realize, that there's not this is all Dutch and this is all British. No, it is a continuing line of people learning how to do this trade, how to be enslavers, and this growing in profit. They came here for profit. They continue to make profit, and that profit brings money into New York well into the 19th century. I always use Hyde Hall as an example of that. That's a 19th century structure, like one of the architectural marvels of the time, all white staff, but that family owns sugar plantations in Jamaica. So where is that money coming from? It's coming from the transatlantic trade, right? It's coming from that product. It's coming from the work of hundreds of enslaved Africans, and it's coming into New York. So that is really, so when I think of what is impacting Phillips Manor Hall, yeah, that's where I'm going. Like, who were investing in those ships? Who were buying from the Phillips? I have always been intrigued by Adolph, and I'm trying not to do that deep dive, but he moves that company very forward, both bringing in the slave directly from Africa, but also the establishment of all that stuff in Barbados. So there's a lot happening.
Yeah, Scott, I'm just so you and Levana knows, because she knows a little bit, but I've been kind of knee deep in Revolutionary War Phillips Manor Hall research. And one of the things I've been working on recently is going through the Book of Negroes, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a document from 1783, kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Sir Guy Carleton, who's overseeing the evacuation of New York, basically under the treaty says we're going to have a record of all of the free people and enslaved people who are leaving New York with the British. And there are a number of people in there from the Phillips Manor. And so I'm working on cross-referencing stuff from them, these references I found, and also trying to cross-reference tenant farmer names to see where people are coming from. Are the tenant farmers loyalists or patriots? Because under the Phillipsburg Proclamation, that was, one of the caveats that in order to be free, you had to escape a rebel enslaver. So I'm trying to figure out, is that actually happening, or are people just escaping and saying they came from a rebel enslaver, or people not keeping track? So that is something we're really trying to track down at Phillips Manor Hall too. These smaller stories that are not as well documented, that you really have to dive into the detail of the records and do a lot of data analysis. So.
And one of the things too, a whole area that we have started working on, but still has so far to go, is the tenants. There are tenants all over the colony, and most of those tenants are enslavers. And we don't know a lot about the tenants themselves as a category. We don't know very much about the tenants, and then we don't keep our eyes and have not looked, because we haven't looked at the tenants, we haven't looked at the tenant enslaved. And so that's an area that we have started. At least we started that project at Phillips Manor Hall. Currently, the exhibit that I'm working on, I'm part of a team that's working on a new permanent exhibit for John Jay's homestead. We're looking at the tenant farmers, and we've been doing that at several of the state sites. But I think that we are, and that had a real impact in Irvington, because the work that Sarah and Kathy, Sarah Cox and Kathy Sears did around the founders of Irvington, those were initially tenants and that were enslavers. And so we recovered that information. But even at, in places like SUNY New Paltz, where they wanted to change the names on the buildings, they researched those people as enslavers and brought all of that slave history forward before they chose to remove those names. So even when things like that are changing, we are gaining that research, and that's one reason I find myself saying that as much as I know people want to get rid of the names and move them out off the streets and off the buildings and things like that, until we do that research, until we can find the enslaved through the enslavers, because we need to go through the enslavers' papers, it is important for us not to remove that name, right? Because the moment we do that, we erase a lot of folks. And it's not just the person who was the enslaver. We erased those that were enslaved. And we're learning a lot. Even as we look at manumission documents going towards 2027, we're learning a lot. And looking at old books that were printed where things were like written as a simple sentence, and then you now read it and say, well, whoa, that's kind of out of character. What does that mean? So, yeah, a lot of work is being done.
Yeah, it's funny. You think that, especially at the American Revolution, that there's nothing left to research, but there definitely is. So,
no, there's a lot, because I think a lot of people are like, I wasn't aware that 1/3 of the Rev War happened in New York. We learned the beginning of it in Massachusetts. We learned the end of it in Virginia. We don't learn that middle section. And that middle section leaves a state that is heavily damaged, economically challenged, and wanting to end slavery. And that's why it's a long process between the time when that law was passed in 1799 and that ending date in 1827, because this is a major labor force that they have to replace. And I've even found myself recently taking a walk and thinking about all of this after work, is that they could not have anticipated the Irish potato famine. They could not have anticipated the hundreds and thousands of Irish who would come here. So they had to make a way for that transition at a time when New York's economy had really been hard hit, and that's what they're doing. And so those gradual abolition laws happen in Pennsylvania, they happen in Connecticut, they happen in New Jersey. So it's a transition. And so what's happening during that transition, there's a lot we really have not looked at.
Well, and I think your point about economics too. I mean, New York is involved in the illegal slave trade up until the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's interesting how long those economic ties stay even after the domestic laws are passed. So,
right, because it's the money. And that's one of the quotes that John Jay says, people have become accustomed, right? It is more than just becoming accustomed to the bodies or the people who are serving you on a day-to-day. It's also becoming accustomed to the level of wealth that one has at their disposal. And as enslavement nation, worldwide starts to break down, that impacts, very much so, heavily impacts the economy. And as we come out of the Rev War, we're burned out, right? Westchester is burned out. Most of the Hudson River Valley is burned out. The western area is burned out because Washington and the Sullivan-Clinton campaign burned out the indigenous. I mean, it's years to recover. This is not just all's well and good and we're, back to going. And because of the naval embargoes, the islands are heavily impacted by the absence of wheat from New York. So there's a lot for us to look at, and I think that the papers are being there. I'm really becoming one with JSTOR and realizing I don't have to print out every paper I see. But there's a lot just even for casual reading. I know, but my second is going to like killing trees. Yes, but there is any area that anyone is curious about through this period, through the 200 plus years, actually all the way up to the Civil War and even beyond. The information is there, so get curious and talk to people about it, because what I find that when I talk to people about something that I'm working on, it is inevitable that somebody else is working on something that helps me move my project along. And I'm able to do that for other people as well. So I think that is that community that we really need and have.
Yeah, I would agree. I've been working with some historians in Westchester County, and they're like, "Oh, well, did you know about this and this archive?" I'm like, "No, please tell me more." All right.
And there's huge collections of papers everywhere, so it's important. I'm sorry.
I'm going to ask if there are any last questions before we close for the evening. I will give a pitch for next month's talk, which is with me. Either online or in person at Phil Snyder Hall. We'll be talking about the tea drinking in New York State. And spoiler alert, it's going to be a lot about the American Revolution. So hopefully you guys will get to join us.
And no, we're not stepping on a British thing, since the first case of tea went into the Netherlands and not into England.
That's right. There wouldn't be
as an afternoon tea person, I just get so annoyed when everyone thinks it started in Britain. No, it was here.
You were late to the party. Anyway, all right. Well, thank you so much, Luvata, for joining us tonight. This was awesome. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. We hope we'll see you this weekend at Pinkster. I know I'll see you, Luvata. And if not, we hope we'll see you in person or online at our next lecture. So have a great night, everybody.
Good night. Bye. Thanks, everyone.